The reputation of the South as a spawning bed for writers is not something of great historical duration. We're really talking about a period of time that began in about, say, the mid-20s, when William Faulkner came from obscurity in Oxford, Mississippi, to write one and then another novel that received critical acclaim.
Author John Egerton on Tennessee Kaleidoscope today. He's written many books of his own, and here he gives his opinions as to why there have been so many well-known writers from the South, and such an increase in the popularity of Southern literature in the past 70 years, beginning when writers formed groups like the Fugitives and the Agrarians in Nashville, and the movement extended to North Carolina, Georgia, and other Southern states, as writers there became more interested in social issues.
And it was in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s that this reputation began to take shape. People in other parts of the country have really not thought of the South as a great breeding ground for writers until the Faulkners and the Eudora Weltys and the Robert Penn Warrens came along. Now, why would this happen in a region as impoverished as the South, as illiterate, as isolated from the American mainstream? I think that as plausible an explanation as any is the fact that this has for much longer than that 60 or 70 year period, for as long as there has been a South, has been a region where the oral tradition has been strong, where storytelling has been important, where courthouse orators and pulpit fire and brimstone preachers and other people in different lines of work in the South, and people who didn't work at all, have been outstanding at the art of telling good stories. As Robert Penn Warren said once, in the North they tell jokes, in the South they tell stories, long, winding, complicated stories that have morals to them and that have irony and all of the great qualities that make good literature. Sometimes stories told by people who would be considered in this day and age illiterate people. They did not read or write, but they certainly could talk, and they told these wonderful stories.
A lot of these people that told the stories wouldn't have been good writers. Somebody had to come along and write down all of this.
That's true, and that somebody probably first of all was William Faulkner, who created out of his ear for a good story and his imagination and his experience in rural Mississippi, a whole world. Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi was an invention of William Faulkner's that became the setting for many of his novels and short stories. It was his success in translating the stories he heard from the ear to the printed page, and his repeated success at that, and the others who came after him, that gave the rest of us permission, if you will, to write stories. And I think that we have people now who, in one way or another, aspire to be another William Faulkner or another Robert Penn Warren or a Flannery O'Connor or a James Baldwin.
Faulkner received the Nobel Prize.
Right, he did win the Nobel Prize in 1949, and in his acceptance speech in Stockholm, he talked about the people of Mississippi who were also the people of his stories, his novels, and he said they will endure, and he was right.
Nashville author John Egerton, who has written numerous articles for publication, in addition to his books, which mainly concern the South. The most recent being Southern Food, and before that, Generations, his account of the Ledford family of Kentucky, covering a period of 250 years and 9 generations, a book which has recently been translated into Japanese. This program made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Tennessee Arts Commission. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, this is Lynn Folk.
He was one of the few American painters who did travel a great deal around the South. He would go on long sketching expeditions. It must have been hard on his wife because he would just take off and stay away as long as he felt like, sometimes for a month or two, sometimes as long as 6 months. And he would just bum around, sometimes hitchhiking, sometimes he'd take a car and travel with a student, and he'd just travel around to odd parts of the country and make sketches of people at work.
Henry Adams, curator for the exhibition Thomas Hart Benton, An Intimate View, recently at the Fine Arts Center at Cheekwood in Nashville. This month-long exhibition ended with a 3-day symposium on regionalism, dance, theater, food, music, and the art of Thomas Hart Benton, the Kansas artist who spent most of his life painting rural scenes and whose final work, completed just before he died at the age of 85, was The Sources of Country Music, a mural on display at Nashville's Country Music Hall of Fame. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, here's Henry Adams as we talked about Benton's style, so familiar to so many viewers.
It's a very energetic, muscular style with a lot of powerful visual rhythms that run through his compositions and that tie the forms together. That personal style is very recognizable, and then his subject matter becomes quite identifiable, his interest in largely the rural aspects of American life.
Of course, the one that Nashvillians are familiar with is the mural in the Country Music Hall of Fame. Could you tell me something about that particular painting?
Yeah, The Sources of Country Music was Benton's last mural, and it was a subject which clearly meant a good deal to him because he was very involved with appreciating country music. He knew many musicians. He himself played the harmonica and actually produced a professional record that's called Saturday Night at Tom Benton's. And it's a remarkable story because, he knew he was getting old when he was at work in that mural, and he had a schedule for himself, and he actually finished it a little bit ahead of schedule because he was pushing himself hard to get it finished. And then the night after it was completed, he went out to his studio to look it over and dropped dead of a heart attack right in front of it. So he was at work right up till the end.
Are any other of his paintings in Tennessee?
The main one that I'm familiar with is The Sources of Country Music, which is, one of his major paintings. He only did about 10 murals, so Nashville is lucky to have one.
He was rather unusual for an artist, I guess, because he supported himself completely with his artwork and painting.
After the 1930s, Benton became quite famous, and after that date, he supported himself entirely from his art. Up till about the age of 40, he had a very hard time making a living, and he worked mostly as an artist, but actually he would often have to pick up other jobs. At one point, he was actually working as a stevedore on the New York wharves. He lived in great poverty through the 1920s, and not till the 1930s did he start to make a good living off his work.
I understand that his paintings, the popularity went into a decline at one time, but now they're getting more popular again.
Yeah, Benton was very famous in the 1930s. He was probably the most famous American artist, and he was the first American artist ever to have his picture appear on the cover of Time magazine. But starting in the 1940s, there was a kind of reaction against the realistic American type of painting that Benton represented. And the two other major regionalists both died in the 1940s, and I think most people thought that Benton was dead too. But he went on living and went on painting, and starting in the 1960s, there was a sudden reawakening of interest in his work when, by that time, he'd become an historical figure.
Henry Adams, curator of American art at the Nelson Adkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, who was at Cheekwood in Nashville recently to lecture on the art of Thomas Hart Benton. This program made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Tennessee Arts Commission. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, this is Lynn Folk.
All the good times have passed and gone. All the good times are over.
Tennessee Kaleidoscope, the music of Tom and Mary Morgan, whose home, studio, and workshop is in Morgan Springs near Dayton, Tennessee. For 25 years, they've built and repaired string instruments, banjos, auto harps, mandolins, and guitars. And with their sons joining them, they've performed as a family group wherever folk music and folk arts are featured in gatherings across the state.
We're involved in as many forms of traditional music as we can possibly get into, and that's to say that once the pioneers brought their fiddle and their banjo in here and started entertaining themselves, then everything that's evolved from that, but staying with acoustic instruments and traditional music and building instruments and going out and playing for people and school kids. We've done about 60 artists in schools. They used to call them artists in education, they call them now.
For the Morgans, their appearances at schools have been some of the most rewarding experiences. And here, Mary tells of one event which was particularly meaningful and gratifying to her.
We had been asked to come to a school here in Ray County to play. And after the program, a teacher brought a little girl over and said that she was very interested in how I played the instrument and would I show her. It turns out the child is hearing impaired severely. She heard the music, and it touched me so.
Can you explain how she heard it?
Actually, they had a sophisticated receiver and transmitter that she and I had on. And she was just so excited when she finally heard that. And then, of course, I got excited, and I did just what I'm doing now. It made us both cry. And that was a very touching experience.
Let me fill in some of the blanks. Mary really left some gaps in that story about the child. The child was afraid of the pick that Mary has on her hand, and she showed her there was nothing to be afraid of. But then when she finally heard this through the equipment that Mary described, there was an interrelationship there that I have trouble understanding, but somehow the fact that Mary was calling her name to her, and she said her own name back to a human being for probably the first time.
She said 3 words.
As a result of hearing music which she had never been able to hear before, the child spoke her name and some other words, all for the first time.
Full credit to the music. That is what inspired her to speak. And we explored low notes and high notes, and I said to her, "That's a low note," and she said, "Low," and it was it was just remarkable. It was the first time she had done that.
Tom and Mary Morgan are founding members of the Chattanooga Area Friends of Folk Music, an organization which now lists more than 100 members active in the perpetuation of the old-time music.
It's just trying to say to people who have a certain need to hear old-timey songs, music has gone helter-skelter into some other categories, and we're still trying to do the same style of parlor songs to some degree that were popular 50, 75, 100 years ago. And for the people who appreciate and have a need to hear these songs again, we feel that we got the way just wide open to try to keep those things alive.
This program made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Tennessee Arts Commission. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, this is Lynn Folk.
And I had done a book that was just published about a 100-room mansion in Vermont, and we decided to kind of approach Union Station the same way, which is a look at its architecture and its roots and the history of its construction, how it fit into the history of Nashville when the railroads were the way to come and go, as well as the way that almost all of your trade and goods and industrial products went in and out of the city, and also the restoration story, which is a real interesting one. I mean, Union Station could very well have ended up a big pile of rubble.
Instead of ending up as a pile of rubble, Nashville's Union Station became a hotel, and since its reopening in early 1987, it's been the focal point of architectural studies and nostalgic social gatherings, prompting memories of the grand days of the railroad. Now there's a new book about it, 1,000 Voices, The History of Union Station, written by Joe Sherman, who came to Tennessee from Vermont, especially to do this project. When I talked with Joe Sherman for Tennessee Kaleidoscope, I asked him if his task of writing had been difficult because he was not a local person familiar with the history of Union Station, which was constructed in the 1890s.
I wanted to put, and I have put, the station in its historical context, where it fit in the history of Nashville. So the research that I had to do to learn what Nashville was like from the end of the Civil War up until modern times was very time-consuming. One of the things I liken Union Station to in my book is in 1975, I call it the bag person of downtown architecture, because it kind of had the impression that people would drive by it, and it evoked in them a sense of they wanted to look the other way, and here was this mammoth landmark that had once kind of inspired awe and been respected, and now was kind of in tatters, and people didn't quite want to, look at it. Now I think that it's been resurrected, that people are less uncomfortable to go by it.
Thousands of visitors have streamed through Union Station since its reopening. Visitors coming to remember arrivals and leave-takings, both happy and sad, and visitors coming to look at the bas-relief figures and friezes decorating the lobby. All the ideas of principal builder Major Eugene C. Lewis, who introduced the artwork, and most of the showmanship incorporated in Union Station.
The alligator pools, which were at track level, where there were 4 and 5 foot long alligators that they brought up from Florida. And then also he was responsible for the artistic interior of the main lobby. It was just becoming popular to introduce art into public spaces. At that time in Nashville, if you want to be exposed to art, you walk by the statue of Andrew Jackson by the Capitol, and there were no art galleries. To come into that environment, particularly for rural people, was very enlightening and strange, because you didn't see anything like this, except possibly in a church. The lobbies of your large train depots were a strange kind of mix of cathedral, art museum, lobby where all kinds of people hung out, place to get something to eat, get your shoes shined, spend some time watching the people arrive. All the people that I've interviewed who worked for the railroad felt that it was a real special and unique place. I don't think there's any place that a person works today that has the same kind of metaphorical strength that the railroad had for being everything. And the people had a kind of pride and concern about their world that's lost in this day and age, as well as I think train travel, I cover in my book, had a sense of graciousness and service that is as alien today to travel as white linen is at a McDonald's.
Architecture, history, and culture, which were centered on the railroad, and even famous train wrecks are covered in Joe Sherman's book on Nashville's Union Station, published by Rutledge Hill Press. This program made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the HCA Foundation, the philanthropic arm of Hospital Corporation of America. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, this is Lynn Folk.
Two years ago, I realized that songwriting was something that I wanted to do, and I'm trying to learn how to do it the right way.
The opportunity to talk to and meet people who really have something credible to say to you is most important.
The Nashville Songwriters Association has a critiquing program for the songwriters and the beginning songwriters.
I am a poet lyricist, and it has been suggested that I submit some of the poems that I've already written as lyrics for song. So my main objective today is to have some of the poems that I've already written critiqued.
Some of the reasons that songwriters come to seminars in Music City, sponsored by the Nashville Songwriters Association International. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, here's Maggie Cavender, Executive Director of the association, as we discuss some of the services available to members and also the necessity for perseverance in this profession.
Perseverance is the only answer, because it's never been easy to get a song recorded or published. And I got to give an awful lot of credit to the people, the professional people in the industry here, who will go there and give their time on a Saturday to try to help these people in any way that they can.
One of the comments I heard at one of the panels, that if a song isn't heard, you might as well not write it. And I know that that is the big barrier, getting it heard.
That's the big barrier. It always has been the big barrier. Oh, since I've been around here with the Songwriters Association, I have seen the number of writers who are published and charting and recorded, which is the ultimate goal, of course. You can get it heard. I always say, if you write a great song, it will be heard and it will be published and it will be recorded. Maybe not tomorrow.
Although the association does not promote songs of members, there is a way for these songs to be heard in weekly workshops held in Nashville.
We have a critique session every time, and this is helping them to bring their work together. Then for the outline in other states and in other countries, where they don't have workshops, they are permitted to send one song at a time in to be critiqued by a workshop panel. And then they turn that tape over and give them, I've always said that I think you can get more from a voice than you can from a written piece of paper. So we give them an audio version of a critique on their work, and that has seemed to help a great many people.
Do you have to be a member to join in on these workshop sessions?
On the workshop sessions, yes, because we offer that as a service to the members.
How does this critique session work? Do they have their things on cassettes, and cassettes are played?
Cassettes, and we play as many as we can in that evening. We ask first for a self-critique of the work, because we ask that writer who's brought a song in to be critiqued to let us know where he feels like he's weak in the song. And this helps the people who are going to critique it later. And it may be that the critique people think, well, that's not the weak point, there's another weak point. And we say, take what you like, throw out what you don't like. It's merely a critique, but it's a great help when you're working with a group of people who are your peers. And there have been collaboration teams formed from these groups.
We hear so much about people coming from everywhere and bringing their instruments and walking up and down Music Row and all, and these sort of sad tales. Is it really that sad?
Occasionally you'll see a person out hitchhiking with a guitar on his back. But we have tried to teach these people that we don't have live auditions anymore, and that there is no place for them to go except the mission. We've done a lot of that through the Songwriters Association by a booklet that we put out that tells them, hey, you've got to have an appointment with a publisher, or you've got to have permission to send your material on cassette, and it's all gone to cassette now. The majority of it is done by mail or through contacts that they make when they come in. And we at the organization here, we furnish a publisher's list, an area publisher's list, to anybody that asks for it. And then we have a telephone in here that can sit down and call their appointments and that sort of thing. The coffee pot goes. This is just home to any songwriter who happens to drop in to see us.
Maggie Cavender, Executive Director of the Nashville Songwriters Association International, with offices located at 803 18th Avenue South, Nashville. This program made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Tennessee Arts Commission. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, this is Lynn Folk.
I like to change. I think it's important for an artist to change. I never want it to be said of my work that once you've seen one, you've seen them all. I started out painting in a very abstract style. I guess about 1968, more and more recognizable subject matter crept into my work, and this continued till 1970. I changed from oils to watercolor.
Since 1974, Chattanooga artist Hubert Shuptrine has been devoting all of his time to the 91 watercolor paintings included in his new book, Home to Jericho, published this year by Oxmoor House. For Tennessee Kaleidoscope, I talked with him about his work and the new book, and also about a previous book, Jericho, the South Beheld, which for him was a cooperative venture with writer James Dickey. Shuptrine began his career as an artist by painting in oils. Here he relates how the change to watercolors came about at the beginning of a vacation in Maine in 1970.
I promised my family that I would not take any paints along, but after 3 or 4 days, I decided I needed to paint, so I went out and bought some little tube watercolors. I had never worked in the medium before, had always disliked it because it seemed so pastel and unimportant, and I wanted my work to be important if possible. But I bought some watercolor, and I couldn't handle the medium at all. And out of frustration and anger, that I thought myself a professional and was unable to do a single color study or sketch that I thought was savable, I continued with the medium, and after a few weeks became so fascinated with it that I've continued since then and work entirely in watercolor.
In addition to changing to watercolors, he also changed his subject matter after leaving Maine.
I stayed there for 8 weeks and then returned to the South and realized that there have been very few painters who have tried to depict and capture what we know as the South. There have been many painters from the South, but very few who have devoted any significant portion of their careers to trying to depict the South. So I wanted to try in some way to do a collection of paintings that would somehow get at the essence of what we call the South.
When asked what he's trying to accomplish with his paintings of the South and its people, Shuptrine refers to this story concerning the X quality.
To me, it's what makes a work of art, and when a painting has X, I know it, everyone else knows it, and when it doesn't have X, it's entirely obvious. I had an editor in New York who was a friend. He was the type individual who would read 4 or 5 manuscripts a day. And I asked him one day, what are you looking for when you read all these manuscripts? And he said, I'm looking for the juice. I'm looking for that certain something that makes even bad writing great. I'm not looking for correct sentence structure or punctuation or proper style, because all of that can be supplied later by an editor. I'm looking for the juice. Later, when I met James Dickey and we decided to do the book Jericho, he said something about beholding rather than merely seeing. When you behold, you see with such intensity that people, places, and things actually enter into you. And I told him this is what I had always called the X quality. Andrew Wyeth calls it getting at the truth of things. So I guess that's the most important element in my painting, is searching for that elusive X. And if I knew exactly what it was or could explain it in words, my problems would be over. But I don't know what it is. But I know that it does have something to do with communication. And I feel that communication really is the ultimate purpose of art after all, and has been since the earliest cave drawings.
An article about Hubert Shuptrine and his new book, Home to Jericho, is a feature of the September-October 1987 edition of the magazine Southern Accents. This program, Tennessee Kaleidoscope, made possible with the joint support of the National Endowment for the Arts and the Tennessee Arts Commission. This is Lynn Folk.